Hello, everybody. I hope you're doing fine. It's kind of hard to believe, but we are wrapping up the semester. So this is our second to last week of classes. And so I'm starting to get questions about grades and things like that. And so I will be either sending out an email with some housekeeping or posting a video sometimes this week. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I've been getting some of those emails and I will be responding to them in some form soon. Okay, so we're going to start this class just like we have every other one this semester with a knowledge check. So it's going to pop up on the left and go ahead and take a few seconds to answer it. Great. So what I hope you cued in on there is that sexual selection is really focused on what helps you get matings and what helps you achieve more offspring from those matings, right? So the only one that isn't sexual selection is the pipefish example of evolving a larger brood sac, because that is kind of fecundity selection, which is just a type of natural selection. It isn't about competition with other individuals of your same sex for access to mates. It's about a physical constraint of the body. All right. So I hope that made sense. So let's move into kind of a review of where we've been and where we're going. All right, so we started this unit out by asking, why does sex even exist? And what are the advantages and the costs of it as a reproductive strategy? And then we talked about, why are there different gamete types, right? We cannot have sexual selection without different gamete types, which lead to different sexes. And then we talked about who should mate multiply to gain higher fitness, right? So, and we went into how individuals who invest more in parental care, either in terms of provisioning gametes or caring for the offspring once they're out of the body, don't benefit as much from mating multiply because they're limited by the resources they have to produce and care for the young. But the individuals who don't invest in offspring as much, they invest a little bit, right? But as much, they are limited by how many individuals they can mate with. And so they're the ones who should be mating more and competing with others to get access to mates. And they're the ones under sexual selection. Then we defined sexual selection, which is kind of what we reviewed just now. And today we're going to talk about forms of selection, all right? But one thing we haven't done yet is really this. How is sexual selection the same or different than natural selection? So we're going to briefly go into that now. So sexual selection also, like natural selection, requires those 4 postulates that we memorized and that you use. Those 4 postulates only change a tiny bit. So postulate 1 has to hold. Individuals within a population have to differ from one another in some sort of phenotype. In addition, the differences have to be at least passed on from parent to offspring. They have to be heritable. Postulate 3 is where we see the change. So with natural selection, we're focused on survival and we're focused on reproducing. Sexual selection, we're focused on something a little bit tighter here. We are not necessarily focused on these things, but we're focused on some individuals are more successful at getting access to mates, right? It's competing among members of your same sex for access to mates, all right? And then postulate 4 also has to hold. It's not that the individuals who get more mates are just lucky. Instead, it's something about their phenotype that they've inherited and that they pass on to their offspring that predicts whether or not they will get more access to mates. Okay, so now there are 2 types of sexual selection. I've introduced them briefly before, I believe, but I want to give you a full definition now. So first, intrasexual selections. So members of the sex who invest less in offspring, right? So remember, the ones that are predicted to mate multiply compete with each other over reproductive access. To sex that invests more in offspring. So in this form of sexual selection, we're talking about sort of a direct competition. It could be fighting, it could be trying to outdo one another, and it doesn't all have to happen before mating. It can happen within the individuals through gametic competition or sperm competition, and it can even happen through infanticide, okay? So, but we're talking about, you can't really see what I'm doing, but I'm like slamming my hands together here. It's like butting heads. It's multiple individuals like actually competing with each other in a usually a physical way. Okay, so now our second one is intersexual selection. And so this is different. So in this case, members of the sex who invests more in offspring so the resource limited sex actively discriminates among potential mates so they're choosing. Okay, this is still competition. This still fits under the sexual selection idea of competition because members of the sex investing least in offspring compete by being more attractive. So they may not be butting heads, right? They may not be directly competing, but they're trying to look more attractive than their neighbor. That's how they're competing with members of their same sex, okay? And so below each of these definitions are sort of the different types of intrasexual selection and inter, and we're going to go through these. Today we're going to do intra, and then on Thursday we'll do inter. So let's start with contests. So we're in intra, so within sex competition, contests. This is where individuals interfere directly with each other for access to mates. So the most famous example, at least for folks from the West Coast, which is where I spend a lot of time, is elephant seals. You see these massive males come charging at each other across the beach, and they're like smashing females that are just laying there. Like, it doesn't matter what's in their way, they charge across it, they slam into each other, and they start butting heads and slamming their necks and their faces against each other until they're both all bloody, like in this picture, and sometimes one will kill the other. but they're competing over who controls the beach, right? So who can access females on that beach. So elephant seals, if you haven't seen some of this, you might watch a video. It's pretty amazing and kind of horrifying, okay? So when you're doing this kind of competition, we can see some sort of antelope, sheep, goat with big horns here competing, and we can see horned beetles, right, in the top using their horn to throw another male around. So all of these things you can think of as like evolving sort of weapons of some sort. So basically contests can create selection pressure to produce traits, to spread traits, sorry. Mutation is the only thing that produces traits, right? To spread traits that give an advantage in combat. So I just mentioned a couple of them, right? So weapons, things like horns and antlers. And also large size. These are usually species with combat. You'll often see the sex that is mate limited is much larger than the other sex because that size gives them an advantage in combat. And so what are they competing for? They can compete for two things. Directly access to mates, or resources that mates need. And their ability to do this is sort of limited by their environment and by their biology. And so I want you to take a minute now and see if you can think through the conditions that could lead to combat. And a question will pop up on the left. So I hope you can see that depending on your mating system, so for example, if all the mates become reproductive at the exact same time, you're going to have a hard time monopolizing mates because while you're mating with another, you can't mate with this other one. And so it limits how many individuals you can mate with, right? The other thing that seems to limit it is how patchy they are. Like if you get groups of potential mates together, that makes it way easier for you to monopolize them than if they're spread out across the landscape. So, in general, for competition to occur, this should say combat, you have to have this. You have to have multiple mates, or the resources to attract them. Must be energetically defendable by an individual, right? If you just can't do it, if it's not possible to spend all your time, right, defending a mate because you're going to run out of food or whatever, then this sort of contest and combat won't evolve, all right? And so whether it's energetically possible depends on the kind of two features I was trying to point out in that question. The spatial distribution of resources and the temporal distribution of mates. Well, potential mates anyway. Okay, so I want you to look over at the graph on this page, and I'm going to warn you now, this graph is terrible. When I took evolution for the first time, and this graph, I could never figure it out. It doesn't make a lot of sense the way it's drawn, but there are some patterns that we can draw from it, and so I want you to see what you can do, all right, with it. So what we're trying to do is figure out what are the best conditions for competition to evolve and the worst conditions, okay? So on the x-axis, we've got distribution of resources. So uniform means spread uniformly across the environment, and slightly clumped all the way then to totally clumped. And then we've got temporal ability of mates. So this means what are all the mates available and reproductive at the same time, or are they coming into heat, for example, at different times, or what is happening? So at the bottom of the y-axis is absolute synchrony, right? So every individual of potential mate in the population becomes reproductive at the exact same time. At the top is total asynchrony, where every individual comes into heat or whatever at different times across the year, for example. So then there's these diagonal lines. And the diagonal lines are connecting two conditions. They're connecting a spatial condition, right? So slightly clumped and slight asynchrony. And they're basically telling you what's the potential for contests to evolve. So the height of the distribution on the bar is the potential for competition to evolve. So we can see as you move towards more clumped, the potential for competition to evolve, direct competition to evolve, increases. Now, the story is a little bit different with synchrony of mates. And this is where this graph is frustrating, because the kind of best condition is somewhere in these two spaces, right? So like the height is here, or the height is here on those lines. So if you had, and let me explain why. If you had total asynchrony, you would have to be mate guarding all year long. When would you eat, right? So that's basically the idea. Always have to be mate guarding. So when get food for survival. It's just impossible, right? Absolute synchrony has the opposite problem. Mating with one individual means don't have time to defend access to another. So you've got a very short breeding period, and basically you've got to spend that time mating, not defending mates, okay? So that's kind of the idea of this graph. And again, it doesn't visually make sense, but these are the patterns that they were trying to communicate. All right, so let's put this in a few more words that might be a little clearer. So here's the best conditions for competition to evolve. You want mates to be moderately asynchronous. Asynchronous in their availability. And resources are totally clumped. Okay, so think about the elephant seals again. So the elephant seals, the females all have to pull out on beaches, right? They sun themselves there. It's where they're protected from sharks. So they pull out on these beaches, and there's a limited number of beaches that they use. So the beach is a resource that is clumped in space, and you get hundreds of females on one beach. So then the females, because the resources are clumped, the mates are clumped, right? And then there's a breeding season. It lasts several months long. Females come into cycle at slightly different times, so they're moderately asynchronous. So you can defend the beach for a limited amount of time and then spend the rest of the year eating to build up your strength to try to defend the beach again. All right? So those are the two best conditions: moderate asynchrony and mate availability, and total clumping of resources. The worst condition is when mates are completely synchronous, and resources are uniformly spread. So again, we kind of went through this. If you're completely synchronous, then the time you spend mating with someone, or think about it the other way, the time you spend mate guarding is time that you don't get to spend mating with someone, and you have very limited time, so you don't want to waste it guarding mates. And then if resources are uniformly spread across the landscape, it is impossible for you to defend the resources, and the mates aren't clumping, right? Because they can be anywhere and get the resource. So it's just very hard to defend multiple mates. Okay, so that is contests as a form of intrasexual selection. The next form of intrasexual selection is gamete competition. This occurs after mating. So this is competition between gametes of the same sex from different individuals, though, to fertilize gametes of other sex. So for example, it would be competition between the sperm of two or more males to fertilize the same set of eggs, right? For example, that's a really common one. All right. So the kind of traits that are selected for are ones that increase the chance your gametes, and not your neighbors, and not another's, fertilize your mate's gametes. So this leads to some pretty kind of crazy adaptations. One that's pretty straightforward, not that exciting, is mate guarding. So even after you mate, you stick around and make sure your partner doesn't mate with anybody else. Another one is copulatory plugs. So garter snakes produce copulatory plugs. So up north in Canada, in Manitoba, there are these dens that a friend of mine used to study, that thousands and thousands of snakes would overwinter in the same den and come out in the spring, and they would engage in these huge mating balls where it would be one female and like 50 males maybe. So whoever actually mates with that female to guard their paternity, to make sure that they're the only one who actually gets to deliver sperm to the female, they put in a copulatory plug, which you can see pictured here. And it's just like a mass of stuff that just fills the opening and basically doesn't allow another male to mate with that female. And it slowly goes away. And so eventually maybe she could mate, but by then she's left the den where there's so many mates, and she's just out in the fields where she's less likely to encounter another mate. So copulatory plugs. Another adaptation that's pretty wild is evolved structures that remove others' gametes before you place your own. So for example, damselflies do this. Damselflies have a structure essentially on the end of their penis that looks like a rake. You can kind of see it in this picture here. And basically it goes in, and then they rake out the sperm and the spermatophore of the last male. So basically they're removing the competition. And that means that if they remove all the other sperm, then that increases the chance that their sperm is going to be what fertilizes the eggs, right? The last thing that you might do if competition between gametes of different individuals is very likely is just produce more gametes. So if you just flood your mate with your gametes, then if you produce more than the other individuals that they mate with, then you are more likely to parent the offspring. Okay? So that is gamete competition. But now we want to think about, what does this look like? What are some of the conditions that might influence gamete competition both within a species and across species? So one of the things that influences the potential for gametic competition is mating systems. So differences in mating systems. Okay. So for example, we can talk about monogamous or polygamous mating systems. So in monogamous species, the sexes pair up and only mate with their single partner. In polygamous species, individuals mate with multiple partners. And so a series of questions are going to pop up that kind of walk you through this graph and get you thinking about the risk of gametic competition based on these two different mating systems. All right, so let's write down our conclusion about what we saw there. So your mating system influences kind of the risk of gamete competition, right? So if everybody in your species mates multiply, you're probably going to experience gamete competition, right? So what does that mean? Well, in species like that, you produce more gametes. So this is the strategy they're using, right? So of all the strategies we discussed, the one they're using is just producing more gametes to defend their paternity, essentially. So across species, we see a general pattern that increased sperm competition, in particular, risk is correlated with increased sperm allocation to each mating. Okay, so if you know you're going to be competing with other gametes, you should increase your gamete expenditure, right? This is a pattern we see across species. But what do we see within species? So again, another activity is going to pop up on your left, and I'd like you to try to think through what you think we'll see within species. So what's interesting is that the pattern you see between species is not the same as the pattern you see within species. So if we're thinking about being strategic with allocating a limited resource, right? So the gametes that are somewhat expensive. So under what conditions should you allocate the most sperm? Well, if she hasn't mated with anyone else, that's when you would allocate the least amount of sperm. Just need enough gametes to fertilize mate's gametes. And if you make small gametes, you're making way more, right? So you don't need to allocate that much of it. When she has mated with multiple others, then the chance of you getting to fertilize the eggs is low. Right? So you may make the decision, and this is an evolutionary decision. Obviously, salamanders are not sitting there weighing their options. But evolutionarily, they may have evolved to allocate less sperm in this situation as well, because especially in a situation where they might encounter another mate soon, right? So you might as well hold off, wait and see if you can find someone who has only mated with one individual. This is your best chance at winning competition. So allocate most. And it's pretty amazing to think that some of these critters really have evolved to have these sort of strategies for when to allocate gametes. But it just goes to show that sexual selection is a strong force driving the evolution of species. Okay, so let's summarize that. So basically, with increased sperm competition intensity, at copulation, one should lower gametes allocated to that mating. All right, and there's a graph that's popped up now on the right that kind of shows you that. So depending on what you expect to encounter, you can see in all three conditions that sort of the maximal is at 2, is when the male it's you and one other present at the mating. If there's more, right, all the lines go down. So you should be expending less. And then these numbers are number of mates likely to encounter. Okay. So that is Gamete Competition as our another form of intrasexual selection. Now let's talk about alternative mating tactics. So the idea here is that the strategy used by mate-limited sex can differ. And this is strategies used to access mates. Okay, so individuals of the same sex are using different strategies. So here's our example, our first one, marine iguanas. So marine iguanas, you've got sort of like the elephant seals actually, you've got females that come out on beaches, they feed in the water, but they come out on these black rocks because they need to warm up. And so they come out onto the beaches, the males can dominate a territory with multiple females. And these older males are bigger because they continuously grow over time, and they fight over these territories. The largest male then wins and gets to copulate with all the females on the territory. And specifically, one of the things that's going to be important is that it takes more than 3 minutes for these males to pass sperm to the female. All right? So that's one tactic. And that's the one used by older males. Now, younger males are currently too small to win contests like that. They can't win a fight for a territory. Although as they age, they will become large males and they might be able to win, right, territory. But while they're young, they are sneakers. So they sneak onto large males' territories and try to mate with the females there. And of course, the large males try to interrupt those matings as fast as possible, right? They're mate guarding. They don't want these smaller males mating with their potential mates. Here's another difference in their tactic, though. So tactic 2 is sneaking. Small males, this is an amazing example. Small males actually ejaculate ahead of time, so ahead of mating, and they just store it so they can quickly pass the sperm when they actually get the chance to mate. So they can pass sperm in less than 3 minutes. So they're sneaky and fast versus big and defending territories, mate guarding. So you've got large and mate guarding and sneaky and fast. All right, so there's 2 tactics happening in the same species among individuals of the same sex. Alternative mating tactics, multiple strategies. Another example can be found in isopods. So in this particular species of isopods, there are 3 genetically determined male types. Genetically determined means the individuals do not switch between them. You are born into a mating tactic, and that's what you have your whole life. So there's alpha males who are large and mate guarding, like the big iguanas, and they have a harem and they win in contests. Then you have beta males that look like females. So they're female mimics, and by doing that, they can sneak past the alpha male to get access to females because he thinks that it's a female. And then there's gamma males. Gamma males don't look like females, but they're fast and sneaky. So they use stealth and speed to sneak past the alpha males and mate with females. So you can see that you can have more than 2 alternative strategies. There are other species as well that have 3 stable strategies. Okay, so I've given you some clues, but I'd like you to think through now this question and answer it on the left. Okay, so what we really needed to cue in on was the genetic basis of the isopod mating system. If you are selecting for each of those traits, right? For those different phenotypes to persist in the population equally, they must each have the same selective advantage. They must achieve the same fitness, or else one of them would eventually drive out the others, right? If one had higher fitness consistently, it would drive out the other mating strategies. So what you've got there is a situation where all strategies have to have equal fitness to persist over time. In the population. Because they are genetically based. Okay, so that's one type of way alternative mating tactics can persist. They lead to equal fitness. Another way alternative mating strategies can persist is the situation in the marine iguana. In this situation, small males are just making the best of a bad situation. They don't need equal fitness because they are going to eventually become the big males. Because they will become one. Come one given time. Right? So they're just trying to up their reproductive output a little bit while they're still small, but really they're going to get the biggest bang once they become the large males, right? So they switch strategies. Based on life stage. Whereas the isopods have same strategy their whole life. And that's why they have to have equal fitness, or else one of those strategies will get lost over time. All right? So that is alternative reproductive strategies, another form of intrasexual selection. So we've talked about 2 strategies that happen during and before mating, right? So combat, alternative mating strategies. And then we talked about a 3rd strategy, gamete competition, that happens after mating but before the offspring are born. And this last form of intrasexual selection happens after the offspring are born. And it's infanticide. So infanticide is the killing of young offspring by a mature animal of the same species. Why would this be an advantage for sexual selection? So I want you to take a minute now and try to think through that. Can you come up with 2 reasons this might increase a mate-limited individual's reproductive success? What is the advantage of infanticide for sexual selection? Okay, I really like talking about infanticide, not because I like infanticide, obviously, but because it reminds me that I should say things like, we are more than our evolutionary roots, right? Just because evolution says it's to your advantage to kill off your mate's children doesn't mean that that's what we do, right? We as humans have other things that we weigh, right? We have deliberate thought and we have the ability to be more than our evolutionary roots. And I think it's really important to remember that, especially when we're talking about sexual selection, because sex roles come up and all kinds of kind of icky things come up. But humans don't have to do these things. We're more than what evolution has made us. Okay? All right. But on that note, let's talk about why evolution says infanticide is a good idea. So what are the advantages? First of all, and I'm guessing maybe you came up with this one, by killing other individuals of your same sex offspring, you increase your relative fitness. Because remember, we don't care about absolute fitness. We don't care about, evolution doesn't care about your absolute fitness. It doesn't care about what number of offspring you have. What matters is how many more offspring you have than your competitors. So if you can artificially inflate the percent of the population that's your offspring by killing off your competitor's offspring, your fitness increases. So by fitness, relative fitness, we mean the proportion of next generation that are your offspring. Okay, so that's one advantage. Another advantage that is really common, maybe more common than you would think, is that it may cause mates to become receptive more rapidly. Receptive or ready to share resources. Okay? Because no longer investing in offspring. They're not investing in anything, you killed it, right? So let's look at an example of this. Giant water bugs. The males carry eggs on their back, and the females produce a ton of eggs, and it fills up the male's back. And if you can't find a place to lay your egg, if you don't have a male to lay your egg on, your eggs die. So female water bugs, if they can't find a place to lay their eggs, will stab the eggs of a male who's currently brooding them until they die, and then she lays her eggs on his back. So it makes resources available that weren't available to her before, right? Basically, she made her mate more receptive again. Same thing with these wattled Iguanas. The females will break the eggs. So males brood the eggs here, and the females will break the eggs of males whose territory she's just won to kill the offspring of the other female, increasing her relative fitness, right? And also getting him ready to take care of her eggs. Lions are the same story. Lions, a male lion basically, essentially on average, runs a pride for about 2 years. So to get a jump start on having offspring old enough that the next male won't kill his offspring, he's got to have his females become receptive sooner. And so to do that, he kills off their offspring, right? So there are reasons that infanticide is a really effective form of intrasexual selection. It's ugly, again, evolution is not kind, right? Not at all, but it is effective, okay? The other point I should add here is that sexual selection is also not about what's good for both partners. It's about what's good for whatever individual it's focused on, right? So in this case, it's for the mate-limited partner. Doesn't matter that it hurts the other partner. They're just worried about their own, right? Evolution is just worried about how many offspring you leave in the next generation, and your interests may not always align with your partners. In this case, this is a pretty extreme case of interests not aligning. And with that, we're done with today's lesson. So I hope you kind of enjoyed exploring all the different ways members of the same sex directly compete with each other for mates through contests, different mating strategies, gamete competition, and then infanticide. Our last class on sexual selection will be on intersexual selection and how members of the same sex compete by being the most attractive to members of the other sex. Okay, and with that, I hope you have a good rest of your day and stop by office hours sometime. Bye.